When I was 18, I was traumatized at work by drunk construction workers. When I tried to report it, I got blamed and threatened. So I went scorched earth and accidentally exposed a ring and my dad's involvement. Now I'm in witness protection. When I was 18, I got my first job at a local Greyhound racing stadium. Basically, my job was to go around to every table in my booth. Each one had around 30 people at the start of every race, 10 times a night, and take their bets. Everything was dealt with cash, so it was a lot of math. But I actually liked it because it meant I got to use my brain instead of just running on autopilot for hours on end. And because I'm Asian. At first, the customers weren't so bad. Sometimes I'd get a drunk man who'd call me incompetent or try to tell me that I somehow scammed them out of money. But most of the customers were well-mannered. Plus, the tips made it worth it. Until Christmas time. Because our usual crowd was replaced by construction workers at their work parties. But not the respectable kind. The type to catcall every mildly attractive girl that passes by their sight, regardless of their age. So when I, a 5-foot girl who's the definition of an easy target, was assigned to them, my stomach turned. In just the first round of bets, a fully grown 40-year-old man with braces literally tried to throw it back on me. Another man told me we should get a hotel room, but then corrected himself and said we didn't even need a hotel room to make love, just a bed. A third one put his arm around me, and his beer belly rubbed against my arm while he told me what a smart and pretty thing I was. So I tried to give the look to the bouncer standing just 50 feet away from me. You know, the one you give your friend when a questionable-looking guy is dancing a little too close to you at the bar. But instead of walking over and offering any sort of security, he just stood there and laughed at me. At that moment, I knew it was up to me to do something. So I did what any 18-year-old angry girl surrounded by big lustful men would do. I kept taking their bets and acted like everything was fine. But inside me, a storm was brewing. So as soon as my shift ended, I went to my supervisor. She was the daughter of my boss and 25, so I thought she would get it. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe a better bouncer, financial compensation, or even just a hug. But I didn't get any of that. Instead, she told me that she had been working there for 5 years, and in that time she's never seen or heard about any girl getting harassed. That I was clearly making things up. That if I said anything like that again, I would be fired. But back then, I didn't even know how to stand up for myself. I was just a girl who wanted to be good at her job. So instead of getting mad, I felt tears sting my eyes. And as soon as my dad came to pick me up, I started ranting. Hard. I wanted him to say something. Anything that acknowledged how crazy everything was. But instead, he just asked me what I had done to make the customer say that. And when I didn't respond, he called me a SLT. Well, now I was crying. And if you think I was overreacting, then you simply don't know what it feels like to be financially self-reliant, physically defenseless, and harassed by a group of men 2 times your age and size. The only one who said anything was my 16th sister. It wasn't anything crazy, just a, wait, that sounds horrible OP. It sounds small, but in that moment, it meant everything. Honestly, I felt like I was living in some alternate reality where I was the crazy one for thinking guys shouldn't be allowed to grope teenagers at their workplace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours online researching workers' rights and harassment laws, thinking there must be some protection for people in my situation. Turned out betting tracks exist in this weird legal gray area with minimal oversight. The more I read, the angrier I got. By morning, my eyes were puffy from crying, but I'd made a decision. If the system wouldn't give me justice, I'd create my own. I talked to Wendy more about it since she was the only one in my corner. I told her I wanted revenge but was scared of losing my job. I needed that money for books and stuff my scholarships didn't cover. We brainstormed ways I could fight back without it being obvious it was me. Wendy's smart as hell and suggested I start collecting evidence. I thought about filing an anonymous complaint with upper management, but after Stacy's reaction, I knew that would go nowhere. So I decided to start recording everything. The next day at work, I kept my phone in my apron pocket with the voice recorder running. I almost got busted when my coworker Jay asked to borrow my phone to call his ride. I panicked and said the battery was dead. After that close call, I used some of my tip money to buy a small recording device that looked like a USB stick. Way less suspicious. Wendy offered to help by making an anonymous Instagram account to expose the stadium, but we worried it could backfire and get me fired. Better to gather solid evidence first. The whole time I was so stressed, I started getting these weird stress hives on my neck, which just added to the fun of feeling like garbage while trying to act normal at work. I started paying more attention to details, like the company logos on the construction workers' jackets. They all worked for Bailey Construction. I looked them up online and found out the owner was James Bailey, who apparently played golf every Sunday with my boss. Great. I needed to be even more careful. I tried talking to my coworker Phoebe about what was happening. She just shrugged and said she'd been dealing with the same shit for 3 years. It's just part of the job, she said. That made me even more determined to do something. This shouldn't be just part of the job for anyone. Phoebe was around 22 and already so beaten down by the system that she considered harassment normal, which honestly broke my heart a little. Wendy helped me create a calendar tracking when the construction crews were scheduled to come in. They had weekly events planned through January for different teams and departments. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. I needed to prepare for a long campaign. At first, I tried researching Bailey Construction's clients, thinking I could maybe contact them about the company's behavior. It got complicated fast with parent companies and subsidiaries and contractors. Wendy suggested we focus first on identifying the specific guys who were the worst offenders. I started taking clear photos of them, pretending to be texting when I was actually snapping pics. One guy noticed and got in my face about it. I quickly lied and said I was documenting bets for tax purposes. He seemed suspicious but dropped it. I was sweating so bad I thought he could hear my heart pounding, but somehow I kept my cool. Through some eavesdropping, I discovered that DT was actually Dan Thompson, the site supervisor at Bailey's biggest project downtown. I also found out he had a reputation for retaliating against anyone who complained about him. Previous waitresses had been fired after incidents with him. This made me more cautious but also more determined to build a solid case. I dug deeper and found that Bailey Construction had settled at least 2 harassment claims in the past 3 years. The terms were confidential, but the fact they settled instead of fighting suggested there was merit to the claims. I created a fake email account and reached out to former employees, hoping someone would talk to me. Through social media and some careful questioning of other staff, I identified several women who'd quit shortly after working with the construction crews. Most were reluctant to talk, but a few shared their stories privately. I created an anonymous chat group where we could share experiences, and within a week, 15 women had joined. Some had stories way worse than mine. It was like lifting a rock and finding this whole disgusting ecosystem underneath that everyone just pretended wasn't there. We were building momentum until Stacy called me into her office. Someone had tipped her off about the group. She warned me about causing trouble and said it would be a shame if I lost my job right before tuition payments were due. I considered quitting right then, but I literally couldn't afford to. Instead, I decided to double down while appearing to back off. When I went back to work that weekend, the construction crew was even worse than before. DT made a point of saying things like, some girls know how to take a compliment and some need to be taught a lesson. They were more handsy, more explicit, and seemed to be targeting me specifically. I suspected Stacy had said something to them about my complaints. I kept my recording device running, capturing everything. Halfway through my shift, the memory filled up. I hadn't expected them to be so non-stop disgusting. I texted Wendy our emergency code. Aunt Flo came to visit early. 20 minutes later, Wendy showed up with my forgotten lunch. Security seemed suspicious and actually searched her bag, but she'd hidden the fresh recording device inside a sandwich. She created a distraction by accidentally knocking over a display of racing programs, and I grabbed the sandwich while everyone was helping pick up papers. Wendy was such a natural at this undercover stuff that I half-jokingly called called her Agent W when she left. The new device captured Brooks bragging to his friends that we do this at every venue, and that management knows to assign the hot young ones to our section. By the end of my shift, my phone had died, so I had to wait anxiously until I got home to back up the recordings. I was starting to see a pattern in how they selected which betting attendants worked with the construction crews. They were all young women, mostly petite, often those who seemed shy or unlikely to push back. When I mentioned this to my manager, he just shrugged and said it was customer preference. So I started tracking the assignments across different race nights, noting who got placed where. I created this whole spreadsheet color-coded by age, appearance, and whether the girl had ever complained before. The pattern was so obvious it made me sick. After some digging on Instagram, I found photos of previous betting girls who'd quit suddenly. Several looked really young, possibly under 18. I started wondering if there were child labor violations happening too. One former employee, who went by the username Scroller98, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop. She showed up in sunglasses and a hat, clearly nervous. She barely sat down before telling me she couldn't really help, because DT had connections with local police officers who work security at the track. You can't win against these guys, she said, then left. That's when I realized I needed to aim higher than local authorities. Through some careful conversations, I discovered that Stacy, my supervisor, had dated DT briefly the previous year, but ended things abruptly. She always seemed uncomfortable when he was around. I approached her carefully, mentioning specific incidents I'd witnessed, not my own experiences. To my surprise, she broke down. You don't understand how this place works, she said. My dad makes a fortune from those construction contracts, and part of the deal is providing entertainment in the form of young betting attendants. I tried to change things when I took over scheduling, but he overruled me. I was shocked. This wasn't just random harassment. It was a systematic practice the stadium profited from. I actually felt a little bad for Stacy, realizing she was trapped in this toxic situation too, but I couldn't let that distract me from the bigger picture. I convinced Phoebe to share her experiences on record. Her testimony was even more disturbing. She revealed that some of the girls were definitely underage with fake IDs, and the bouncers knew it. She described instances where girls were pressured to go to private parties after work. We were potentially dealing with sex trafficking, not just harassment. I wanted to go straight to state authorities, but Wendy reminded me we needed absolutely solid evidence that couldn't be dismissed. We planned a sting operation during the championship races, the biggest event of the season when all the construction crews would be present. I coordinated with my online support group, and we planned for everyone to work that night wearing hidden cameras. Several backed out at the last minute, afraid of losing their jobs or worse. In the end, only me and 3 others agreed to go through with it. I spent the morning of the sting throwing up from nerves, which my mom assumed was just a stomach bug, if she only knew. The night of the sting, I was assigned to DT's section again. My recording device malfunctioned almost immediately. The battery indicator had been wrong. I had to rely on the other girls to capture evidence. One of them, Linda, managed to record DT paying off the bouncer to ignore complaints and encourage certain girls to attend after parties. But while she was recording, the bouncer noticed her acting suspicious. I created a distraction by accidentally spilling a tray of drinks all over DT. He was furious, but it gave Linda time to slip away. DT grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, saying he knew what I was up to and I'd regret it. Phoebe stepped in, claiming she needed my help with a customer, while secretly recording the entire confrontation on her phone. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out, but somehow I kept it together until the end of my shift. The bruises on my arm formed this perfect fingerprint pattern that I photographed as soon as I got to the bathroom. When my dad picked me up that night, I was shaking. Instead of asking why, he immediately criticized how I looked. You're a mess. You can't show up to work like that and expect people to respect you. I finally snapped and played him one of the recordings of what I dealt with daily. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "What were you doing to attract that kind of attention? Those are just guys being guys. You put yourself in that situation." I realized then that my father's toxicity went way deeper than I thought. The ride home was completely silent. I stared out the window just counting streetlights to keep from screaming or crying. At home, I tried appealing to my mom for support. Her response floored me. "That track has always had that reputation. I told your father not to let you work there." She knew and had said nothing. My own mother had let me walk into that situation without warning me. Wendy tried standing up for me, telling our parents they were being horrible. Dad grounded her for disrespect and took her phone. We started communicating through notes hidden in her school textbooks that our parents never checked. I decided I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The problem was I only had about $600 saved up, not enough for an apartment. I called my older cousin Patrick, who had a spare room in his apartment across town. He immediately offered to let me stay rent-free until I could get on my feet. I packed my essentials while my parents were at work, but my dad came home unexpectedly. He demanded to know what I was doing. I told him I was moving out. He threatened to cut off my college fund if I left. I revealed I'd been recording his verbal abuse too. He backed down but said I was dead to the family if I walked out. I moved to Patrick's that afternoon. While relieved to be out, I worried constantly about Wendy still living with them. I texted her hourly check-ins disguised as casual conversation about homework or TV shows. Patrick was incredibly supportive, encouraging me to focus on building my case, but I felt guilty for leaving Wendy behind. We developed a plan where Patrick would help Wendy spend weekends at his place, claiming she was attending study groups. My parents forbade her from visiting me, calling me a bad influence. Patrick started driving by our house pretending to be delivering food to pass notes between us. We discovered our parents were checking Wendy's phone but never monitored her school email account. That became our secure communication channel. Wendy reported increasing verbal abuse at home after I left. As a 16-year-old, she couldn't legally move out without parental consent. I started documenting everything for a potential emancipation case and accelerated my plans to expose both the stadium and our parents. I visited a free legal aid clinic to discuss emancipation options for Wendy. They explained the process could take months unless there was clear evidence of abuse or neglect. While gathering documentation, I discovered our father had been embezzling from his accounting job. I hesitated to use this information. It felt like crossing a line. Wendy convinced me that ethical lines had already been crossed. I anonymously tipped off his company about irregularities in certain accounts but felt immediate regret. I compromised by only revealing enough to trigger an audit rather than immediate termination. I wasn't trying to destroy him, just create enough distraction that he'd ease up on Wendy. I spent the next few nights stress baking, and Patrick's freezer filled up with enough stress cookies to feed a small army. Patrick helped organize all my evidence and introduced me to his friend Scott, a law student specializing in labor issues. Scott reviewed everything and said we had a potentially strong case, but warned that going public could have consequences I wasn't prepared for. He suggested approaching a state labor investigator first, to keep things official but controlled. Scott was super patient explaining all the legal stuff to me, even when I interrupted him like 50 times with questions. The labor investigator, Mr. Reynolds, seemed genuinely interested in our evidence, but explained his jurisdiction was limited to wage and hour violations. He referred us to MB, a specialized investigator with the state's criminal division who handled more complex cases, including potential trafficking. Meeting with MB was intimidating. She was a no-nonsense former prosecutor who asked direct, sometimes uncomfortable questions. She had this way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see right through any BS. After reviewing our evidence package, she explained that building a comprehensive case would take months of careful work. I would need to continue working at the stadium to maintain access and gather more specific evidence. I almost had a panic attack at the thought of going back there, but I knew it was necessary. When I returned to work, I discovered my schedule had been changed to exclusively cover DT's section. Someone in management clearly suspected I was gathering evidence and wanted to intimidate me. I kept documenting violations while pretending to comply with everything. I started having these horrific nightmares where I was trapped in the stadium with no exits, but I pushed through it. I noticed a new girl, Mia, being targeted by the same harassers. She looked terrified and overwhelmed. I subtly warned her during a break, and brought her into our alliance. Mia revealed she was actually 17 with fake documentation. She was terrified of being discovered because her family's immigration status was complicated. This added another layer dash. The stadium was knowingly employing underage workers in a dangerous environment. I added child labor violations to our case file, but this increased the complexity and time needed to build the case. MB suggested bringing in a specialized child protection investigator named Kelly to help navigate those aspects. Kelly wanted to move immediately on the child labor charges, but MB cautioned that a limited approach might let the bigger offenders escape with minor penalties. They compromised on a 2-week timeline to build a larger case while ensuring the immediate safety of the minors involved. I was getting so stressed that I developed this eye twitch that wouldn't go away. Patrick said I looked like a cartoon character about to explode, which actually made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Our support group grew to include several current employees, but someone started spreading rumors about a snitch working with authorities. I created a disinformation campaign, spreading fake rumors about investigations into tax issues and gambling violations to mask our actual focus. This actually worked pretty well. Management started doing random register checks looking for skimming, which kept them distracted from our real investigation. One night while working, I noticed DT leading a visibly intoxicated young woman toward the exit. She was stumbling and looked barely conscious. When I tried to follow, security blocked my path. I called Patrick, who was waiting nearby, and he followed DT's car to a motel about 2 miles from the track. Patrick photographed DT and several other men from the construction crew bringing multiple young women into a motel room. We couldn't verify their ages from the photos, but several looked very young. MB used her resources to identify 2 of the women as former stadium employees who were under 18. She needed their testimony to proceed with certain charges, so I reached out through our online support group. One former employee, Tess, agreed to testify, but only with guaranteed protection. The investigators arranged emergency housing and identity protection for her. We literally had to meet her at a gas station and drive her to a safe house, which felt like something straight out of a movie. As our case built momentum, I found a note in my work locker that simply read, "Watch your back." Instead of being intimidated, I installed security cameras in Patrick's apartment and started carrying pepper spray. Patrick taught me some basic self-defense moves, which made me feel marginally better, but also highlighted how serious the situation had become. Tess met with the investigation team and shared details that shocked even MB. Her story implicated not just the stadium management and construction company, but also high-ranking city officials who attended private parties with the girls. MB had to recuse herself due to conflicts and brought in state-level investigators. The state team arrived and reviewed all our evidence but informed us they needed to build an airtight case before acting. Our timeline extended another month, which was frustrating but necessary. I struggled maintaining my cover at work, but noticed subtle changes. Management started rotating more experienced women to the construction crew's tables and implemented a 2-server policy where no one worked those sections alone. I suspected someone had leaked information about the investigation. They were trying to clean up their act, but it was way too late for that. Through careful observation and conversations with other employees, I discovered a pattern where certain betting girls were gifted to business partners at after parties. There weren't direct financial transactions I could find, but the relationships between the stadium, construction companies, and local businesses suggested an organized system. I started mapping these connections on Patrick's spare bedroom wall with sticky notes and string like some conspiracy theorist, but it actually helped us visualize the network. Meanwhile, Wendy hacked into our father's email account looking for evidence of his knowledge about the stadium. She found correspondence that suggested he not only knew about the practices, but had facilitated introductions between the stadium owner and certain clients. I had to confront the possibility that my father was connected to the corruption. I actually threw up when I read those emails. It's one thing to suspect your dad is a jerk, another to find evidence he's involved in trafficking. I confronted Patrick about my father's potential involvement, wondering if he knew more than he'd shared. Patrick admitted he'd suspected our father's criminal connections for years. He revealed he'd been gathering evidence of financial crimes, hoping to protect Wendy and me by building a separate case. He showed me a hidden file containing years of documentation, photographs, recorded conversations, and financial records. Finding out Patrick had been quietly watching out for us for years made me cry from gratitude. I reviewed the evidence against my father and discovered he appeared to be a middleman rather than a ringleader in the operation. He connected clients with the stadium owner and received finder's fees. I added this information to our case while maintaining focus on DT and the larger system. The investigation identified a network connecting the stadium, construction companies, and city contracts. The evidence showed a pattern of bribery and exploitation, but much of it was circumstantial. MB suggested an undercover operation to gather more direct evidence. I volunteered to wear a wire at an upcoming VIP event, but the investigators deemed it too dangerous given that I was already known to the targets. They recruited a professional undercover agent named Ramona, who was introduced as a new betting girl. Ramona successfully infiltrated the inner circle, but DT seemed suspicious of her from the start. To divert attention, I created a fake rivalry with her, making sure others overheard me complaining about the new girl taking my tables. I was so convincing that other waitresses started comforting me about that bitch stealing your tips. I felt bad about spreading negativity, but figured the end justified the means. The rivalry distraction worked, and Ramona gathered crucial evidence about the operation. Then DT suddenly invited both of us to an after-hours party at his lake house. The investigators strongly advised against attending, but Ramona and I both recognized it as potentially our best opportunity for conclusive evidence. We agreed to go with extensive backup nearby and emergency extraction plans in place. I was terrified, but kept thinking about Mia and all the other girls who'd been victimized. At the party, I witnessed DT explicitly offering young betting girls to business associates. The music was too loud for my recording device to capture clear audio. Ramona created a distraction by pretending to be extremely drunk and knocking over a table, while I planted additional listening devices around the house. I literally taped one under a side table while pretending to pick up napkins. The planted devices captured explicit conversations about the program of recruiting vulnerable girls, grooming them at the track, and eventually introducing them to exclusive clients. Then my father unexpectedly arrived at the party. I had to hide in a storage closet to avoid being seen. While hiding, I overheard him discussing me with DT. My father was complaining that I had potential but was too difficult to control. DT laughed and said he had ways to handle difficult girls. I realized with horror that my father had actually tried to include me in their trafficking scheme. I recorded the entire conversation, fighting nausea the whole time. I was crammed between mop buckets and cleaning supplies, trembling so hard I worried they'd hear the equipment rattling. My hiding spot was discovered by a security guard checking the house. I pretended to be looking for cleaning supplies for a spill and managed to talk my way out of suspicion. After making sure Ramona was safely extracted by her backup team, I left the party. On the drive back to Patrick's, I noticed a car following me. I executed our predetermined evasion plan, taking random turns and eventually pulling into a police station parking lot. The car drove past, and I waited 30 minutes before proceeding to our designated safe house. I kept checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, heart pounding each time headlights appeared behind me. At the safe house, investigators reviewed reviewed the new evidence. While damning, they determined they still needed stronger connections to certain charges to ensure convictions. They planned a coordinated sting at the stadium's biggest annual event, the championship derby, when all major players would be present. I helped design the operation based on my insider knowledge of the stadium layout, staff rotations, and security protocols. I was told I couldn't participate directly, which was frustrating but understandable. Instead, I created detailed maps and schedules for the investigators. I spent hours color-coding everything and adding notes about which security guards could be trusted, almost none, and which ones were definitely in on the scheme. The night before the sting, I discovered through Wendy, who was still monitoring our father's emails, that he had warned DT about increased police activity around the stadium. I couldn't reach the investigation team in time to update their plans. I improvised by anonymously calling in a false tip about drug dealing in the parking lot to ensure police presence would seem normal. I felt guilty about giving the police a fake tip, but figured it was a justified means to an end in this situation. The sting operation began with undercover officers in place throughout the stadium. DT appeared unusually cautious, holding meetings in open areas and speaking vaguely. I texted Phoebe, who was working that night, and suggested she accidentally spilled drinks on DT's paperwork. This forced him to use the backup room where cameras had already been planted. The diversion worked perfectly, but DT spoke in coded language about merchandise and deliveries. The investigators struggled to gather explicit evidence that would hold up in court. From the surveillance van where I was monitoring the operation, I grew frustrated with the lack of progress. I suggested sending in Ramona with specific questions designed to elicit incriminating responses about the ages of the girls and the services expected. Ramona successfully got DT talking about processing new girls and training procedures, but a stadium manager interrupted before he made explicitly incriminating statements. The operation wasn't going as smoothly as those police procedurals on TV. Real investigations are apparently messy and frustrating. The investigation leader wanted to abort the operation, believing we had insufficient evidence for the most serious charges. I convinced them that the annual event was our only chance to catch everyone together, pointing out patterns from previous years where girls were transported after the main event. They agreed to continue with modified objectives, focusing on documenting clear labor violations while watching for more serious crimes. I basically refused to give up after everything we'd been through, and thankfully they listened. Suddenly, Wendy called with urgent news. Our father was bringing additional underage girls to the event through a service entrance. The operation pivoted to intercept this more serious crime in progress. Police positioned themselves to catch the handoff, but my father took an unexpected route through the kitchens. Using my knowledge of the stadium layout, I guided the police through back channels to intercept him. Officers caught my father with 3 underage girls who had been told they were interviewing for hostess positions. When he saw the police, he attempted to flee through the crowded stadium, causing a public scene as officers pursued him. I watched on the security feed as my own father was tackled and handcuffed. I felt nothing but cold rage. The commotion alerted DT and other conspirators to the police presence, but all exits had already been secured by state police. Investigators successfully detained the key figures while evidence teams swept the offices, seizing computers and documents. The raid resulted in multiple arrests, including DT, my father, and several stadium managers. Many powerful figures remained untouched, however, as they'd been careful to maintain distance from direct criminal activity. I provided additional evidence connecting these higher-level officials to the operation through financial records and recorded conversations. The investigators used my information to expand their case, but the suspects hired expensive attorneys who immediately began fighting the charges. I wasn't surprised that the rich guys could afford better lawyers. That's how the system works, right? The prosecution team requested my direct testimony for the preliminary hearings and eventual trial. I agreed to testify publicly, despite the risks. Almost immediately, I began receiving threatening messages through various channels. The prosecutors arranged for me to enter a temporary witness protection program until the trial concluded. I had to change my phone number, move to a new apartment, and basically disappear from social media. It was like erasing my entire existence, which was both terrifying and oddly freeing. The preliminary hearings began with my testimony about what I'd witnessed and experienced. The defense attorneys brutally attacked my character, suggesting I was seeking revenge for being fired, a lie, or trying to extort money through false accusations. MB helped me prepare psychologically for the cross-examination, teaching me to stay calm and stick to factual statements. I maintained my composure during questioning, even when they tried to provoke emotional responses. The defense lawyer kept trying to make me lose my temper, asking the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, but I just kept answering calmly and factually. When the defense presented edited recordings of my conversations that distorted their meaning, I countered by revealing my complete unedited archives that provided full context. The case gained significant media attention, with reporters digging into my personal life and background. Rather than let them control the narrative, I decided to publicly tell my complete story through a carefully selected journalist known for covering human trafficking cases ethically. My interview created public outrage and support for the prosecution, but also led to my mother publicly defending my father. She claimed I was mentally unstable and seeking attention. This betrayal pushed Wendy to formally petition for emancipation with my support. Having my mother go on local news to call me a liar was a new low. I stopped watching TV altogether after that. The family court reviewed Wendy's case thoroughly. Our mother fought to maintain custody, claiming she was an innocent victim of our father's crimes. I submitted recordings of our mother's enabling behavior, including her admission that she knew about the stadium's reputation before I worked there. The judge granted Wendy temporary independence, but required ongoing supervision given her age. Patrick became Wendy's legal guardian while the criminal case proceeded. Watching Wendy pack her things to leave was bittersweet. I was happy she was getting out, but sad that our family had imploded so completely. Prosecutors offered plea deals to minor players in exchange for testimony against DT and the other ringleaders. Several key witnesses mysteriously withdrew their statements just before they were scheduled to testify. I helped investigators identify who might be threatening witnesses based on relationships and connections I'd observed at the stadium. Some of the witnesses were clearly terrified, and I couldn't really blame them. I felt guilty that I had the protection of the program while they were still vulnerable. The trial date approached with strong evidence against most defendants. DT's defense team filed motions to suppress key recordings claiming they were obtained illegally. Scott and I researched legal precedents to support the admissibility of evidence gathered by employees documenting their own workplace experiences. The judge allowed most evidence but excluded some of my early recordings that might have violated specific state wiretapping laws. The prosecution adjusted their strategy to focus on the testimony of multiple victims, showing a pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents. I testified for 3 grueling days, maintaining my composure even when facing my father across the courtroom. The defense tried repeatedly to shake my credibility, but the consistency of my testimony held up against aggressive questioning. Every time I looked at my father, he would stare back with this mixture of hatred and something else, maybe disappointment that his own daughter had ruined his operation. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on most counts. DT, my father, and 3 others received significant prison sentences for charges ranging from labor violations to human trafficking. Several others received lesser sentences for their roles as enablers and facilitators. I sat perfectly still as the verdicts were read, afraid I might break down if I moved even an inch. While I felt vindicated by the verdicts, I learned that some powerful figures had negotiated immunity in exchange for information. This led me to work with advocacy groups to push for legislative reforms that would close loopholes and strengthen protections for vulnerable title Workers. With the trial concluded, I tried returning to normal life but experienced PTSD symptoms, panic attacks in crowded places, nightmares, and hypervigilance. I began therapy with a counselor specializing in trauma recovery, who helped me develop coping strategies. The first time I tried going to a mall after everything, I had a full panic attack in the food court and had to leave. Recovery wasn't linear. Some days were fine, others were impossible. I received a modest settlement from the stadium but had to sign a non-disclosure agreement about specific details of the case. I used the money to pay for college while finding ways to still advocate within the legal boundaries of the agreement. I became an expert at talking about hypothetical situations and similar cases elsewhere as a way to raise awareness without violating the NDA. Wendy struggled academically after the ordeal, her grades dropping as she processed the trauma of family betrayal. I created a supportive study environment at Patrick's apartment where we'd have scheduled homework sessions and reward systems. Gradually, both of us rebuilt our academic confidence and performance. We developed this ritual where we'd watch terrible B movies after finishing major assignments. The worse the movie, the better. I attempted reconnecting with our mother several times, but each conversation involved her blaming me for destroying the family and defending my father's actions. I established firm boundaries while leaving the door open for future reconciliation, if she ever truly acknowledged the harm done. I think she wanted to believe my father was innocent, because accepting the truth meant accepting her own complicity in enabling him for decades. We received an unexpected letter from our father in prison about 6 months after the trial. Rather than apologizing, it contained justifications for his actions and blame toward me for misunderstanding his intentions. Wendy and I decided to focus on our future, rather than hoping for his redemption. We burned the letter in Patrick's backyard fire pit in a mini ceremony to symbolically move on. I applied for a scholarship program specifically for survivors of exploitation and trafficking. The application required detailing my trauma and recovery journey. Though difficult to write, I transformed my experience into powerful advocacy essays that emphasized resilience and determination. I received the scholarship and started college full-time. Despite academic success, I felt isolated among peers who couldn't relate to my experiences. Their concerns about dating drama and party invitations seemed trivial compared to court cases and witness protection. For them, a bad day was a pop quiz or getting ghosted by a Tinder match. For me, it was getting new threatening notes or having flashbacks during class. I created a campus support group for survivors of exploitation, providing a space where people with similar experiences could connect. The group grew quickly, attracting not just students but community members. I struggled balancing leadership responsibilities with my studies, especially as the group attracted media attention. I trained other members to share responsibilities, creating a sustainable structure that didn't depend solely on me. We developed a rotation system for leading meetings and speaking at events so no one person carried the whole burden. I got invited to speak at a legislative hearing on labor reform, focusing on protections for young workers. Public speaking triggered my anxiety, especially knowing the testimony would be public record. Wendy helped me prepare through repeated practice sessions until I could deliver my message clearly despite the anxiety. My testimony influenced new protective legislation requiring better oversight of businesses with predominantly young employees. Implementation faced industry pushback, with many businesses claiming the regulations were burdensome. I partnered with legal advocates to monitor compliance and document continued violations. I developed a knack for translating legalese into plain English, which helped convince ordinary people why these protections mattered. Wendy decided she wanted to become a lawyer specializing in cases like ours. She worried about affording law school, so I helped her apply for early college programs with scholarships and mentored her through the process. She's way smarter than I ever was, and watching her find her purpose through all this trauma has been one of the few silver linings. Our mother eventually reached out claiming she changed after therapy and divorce. While her behavior showed limited growth, she stopped actively defending our father. She still minimized her role in enabling the abuse. We maintained emotional distance while acknowledging her small improvements. Baby steps, I guess. I started dating someone who initially seemed supportive of my advocacy work. As things got more serious, he became uncomfortable with how much of my life was devoted to fighting exploitation. He wanted me to move on and focus on normal couple things. I recognized I needed a partner who fully understood my mission and the importance of the work. The breakup was painful but necessary. I wasn't going to shrink myself to make someone else comfortable. Wendy and I visited our father one last time in prison, hoping for closure. He continued minimizing his actions and portraying himself as a victim of circumstances. We achieved closure not by receiving his remorse, which never came, but by acknowledging we could heal without it. His choices weren't our burden to carry. Walking out of that prison was the most liberating feeling. We were finally free of the need for his approval or understanding. I graduated with honors in criminal justice, but felt uncertain about my career path. I had options in law enforcement, victim advocacy, or policy work. After considering various offers, I accepted a position with a nonprofit focused on preventing labor exploitation of young workers. 3 years after the trial, I've transformed my traumatic experience into meaningful change. I now work as an advocate for the State Labor Board, focusing specifically on cases involving vulnerable workers and potential trafficking. Wendy, now a pre-law student on full scholarship, often joins me for community education events where we share a story to help others recognize warning signs. Our mother, after finally completing extensive therapy, has slowly rebuilt a limited relationship with us, though we maintain clear boundaries. Patrick remains a steady presence in our lives, hosting monthly family dinners where the conversation often turns to our ongoing advocacy work. The racing stadium where everything began has been converted into a community center following bankruptcy, a transformation I find deeply satisfying. Several of my former coworkers have become lifelong friends, with Phoebe now running a hotline for exploited workers. I still occasionally experience anxiety in crowded places, but my therapist has helped me develop effective coping strategies. When DT came up for parole after serving minimum time, I organized a successful campaign to demonstrate the lasting impact of his crimes, resulting in his petition being denied. I occasionally receive letters from young women who've escaped similar situations after hearing me speak, each one reinforcing my commitment to the cause. Though healing remains an ongoing process, I've found purpose in protecting others from experiencing what I endured. Most importantly, the once frightened betting girl who couldn't stand up for herself now trains others to recognize their worth and fight systemic injustice. Wendy and I have become each other's strongest allies, our bond forged through adversity into unbreakable sisterhood. As we often remind each other, sometimes the best revenge isn't just seeing justice served, it's creating a world where such injustice becomes increasingly impossible.